Next, I want to cover Chapter 8, California's cultures, ethnicities, and lifestyles. Um, One thing to note is that the lectures will be a bit shorter in this part of for these chapters because the material should be a little bit easier to grasp than some of the physical geography. So again, we're covering a little bit more of the cultural side rather than the physical aspects of California. And I want to define a few things first. So in geography, we have a concept called the cultural landscape, which is the human or cultural imprints on the physical landscape. And part of that is part of an element of people's culture is their ethnicity, their shared ancestry or culture. And this can be a complex thing, and it's different than race. And one thing I want to point out here, this is a census form. And when we look at statistics of the makeup of people in California, oftentimes we'll see categories like white, black, Asian, and then other elements of being Hispanic or not. And that's sort of a relic of how census data has been recorded in the past. In the past, it has been by race, and then there was sort of a yes or no if people were Hispanic. So it's not the ideal, but to have continuity of data with past data, it's sort of necessary to use these same categories. So ethnicity is more about identity within a group of people who share cultural traditions and oftentimes a particular homeland. And that's different than the concept of race. Race is more of a biological concept, and it's really an oversimplification, and it's not a accurate way of describing people, because once we were able to look at the human genetics, what we find is that there's more variation within groups that would be called a race than there is between different groups of different races. So humans we're all the same. What's really different is cultural. And so cultural or ethnicity is often tied to a place where members of an ethnic group or their ancestors were born and raised. And they also have traits they also have practices that are done in these places as well. So place is another term in cultural geography that describes sort of rather than a discrete location, like an absolute location, it's more of a mental thing. A place could be a homeland, or it could be a community, or a town, or it could be a special community within an urban area. So some of the cultural groups in California, the earliest were the Native Americans, or California Indians. And California had the largest concentration of indigenous people before the Europeans arrived. Because of California's diverse landscapes, we had a very complex set of different ethnic groups of indigenous people. And as we mentioned in the last module, that the severe treatment by the Spanish, the Mexicans, and then by the United States really their numbers were declined rapidly through the 1900s. There are some cases of recent financial gains by some indigenous groups, but those are not always geographically equal. That if a group is able to have a casino near an urban center, that's a lot different than having a casino near one of the less populated parts of the state in Northern California. The next cultural group is the Hispanic or Latino, who've had a long history in California. And one way that you see that on the landscape is if you think of the place names around you and where you live, that many of these are Spanish place names. And one thing about Hispanic or Latino groups is they have the highest immigration rates into California, that their population is equal to the non-Hispanic white population. And they've been increasing in political and economic power over time. African Americans have had a long history in California as well. They've faced segregation and institutionalized racism after the gold rush. And most of the migrants have gone to urban areas such as San Francisco or Los Angeles or Oakland, California, but not all. There are some unique cases of places like Allensworth, which is in Tulare County, which is the only US town planned, built, and settled by African Americans in the early 1900s. And there's Allensworth gets the most attention, but there's other settlements like Allensworth throughout the Central Valley. For example, in Fairmead, California, which is up near Merced County. It's actually Madera County, but it's kind of towards Merced County. And as you know, there's many other ethnic groups in California, such as South Asian groups. South Asia would be countries near India, so India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And other different ethnic groups as well. Armenians fled there was a genocide in World War I, where many Armenians fled, and also they were part of the former Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union dissolved, a large wave of migrants from the area of Armenia moved to California. Their populations are clustered in Glendale in Southern California and also in Fresno. Persians, or people from Iran, Los Angeles has the greatest concentration of Iranians outside of Iran. And so in fact, there's a term and there's an associated video that we'll watch called Tehranangeles, which is talking about how the parts of Los Angeles that are where Persian culture is very dominant. And other Asian migration as well, that Asians make up a very large part of California's population from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and also from the Pacific Islands as well. These are the largest, they're some of the largest ethnic groups in the United States. And in some cases, some of the largest settlements outside of their homelands for certain groups are in California. Enclaves such as Little Manila in Stockton, California are examples of ethnic enclaves where this is a Filipino enclave. So what are enclaves? These are areas with high concentrations of a particular group. So you think of these are often thought of as Chinatown, Japantown, or so on. And these initially developed because of segregation, that people were forced to live in separate communities. But there's modern enclaves that are not because of people being forced to live in a place, but there are certain attractions to people living with each other in certain areas. Probably the most notable that San Francisco's Chinatown gets the most attention. The largest concentration of Chinese migrants are actually in Southern California in an area called Monterey Park and the western San Gabriel Valley, sort of just east of Los Angeles. In addition to migrations from other countries, there are also internal migrations. So the Dust Bowl migrations in the 1930s during the Great Depression. This was an ecological disaster that wiped out farming in much of the Midwest, and that sent a large number of migrants to California. So the term Okies, some of them were from Oklahoma, but not all, in fact, not most. But the term Okie refers to people who migrated from the Midwest to California. They also brought culture with them as well. So one example is the country music in Bakersfield. Bakersfield was a large area of settlement of people during the Dust Bowl era, and they brought unique kind of country music sound that has become kind of known throughout the world. So Bakersfield is actually known as the Nashville West, where Nashville is the capital of country music, and Bakersfield has a similar type of status. Now, some other components of language are of California culture are languages. There is a high diversity, with diverse ethnic groups comes diversity of languages. So there's over 100 languages spoken in California, and a very large percentage of people who do not speak English at home, they speak a different language. So for example, Spanish is frequently spoken in California, but also East Asian languages. About 18% of people speak some type of amongst the people who speak a language other than English, a significant number are East Asian languages such as Chinese or Vietnamese or Japanese. And enclaves don't have to be ethnic. There are other types of enclaves in California too, such as gay and lesbian enclaves in places like West Hollywood in Southern California or the Castro District in San Francisco. And so one thing I'd like you to think about when you read the chapter is, why do ethnic or other groups form enclaves? And part of it really has to do with the cultural relationships between different groups and also within groups. And enclaves are part of what we might call within group cooperation. That these different groups, they can pool resources, they can overcome discrimination, they're welcome newcomers. And so, you know, ironically, it's almost sort of a self-imposed segregation where there are some advantages of people coming together in these different enclaves. And another aspect of California culture is that California might be considered what's called a modern cultural hearth. Cultural hearths, the concept is that there are cultures and innovations develop in places and then they diffuse or spread to other places. And California is more sort of a modern example of this, where in Silicon Valley and Hollywood and other places, that a lot of things that are innovated in California become sort of these worldwide phenomena. So things like Facebook, Google, Hollywood, and even Levi's.